So, the programme, Who Do You Think You Are? You might be familiar with this programme. It's on BBC, and it's where celebrities are helped to trace members of their families from the distant past and discover their stories. And the reason why it's given that title, Who Do You Think You Are? And the reason why it's frequently so moving and indeed emotional for those involved is because in tracing their ancestors, these celebrities are discovering something deeper about themselves. They're discovering more about the story that they belong to. And that's the reason why we are having this series over June called this, Learning from Our Forebears. Similar to Who Do You Think You Are? Because in seeking to learn more about those who've gone before us at this church, which has existed here for 160 years, we discover more about the story that we belong to. So learning from our forebears. The other reason I've got to admit is so I can use the gag that even Goldilocks only had 3 bears. Yep, okay, and that's an intelligence test as well about how long it takes you to work that one out. But basically, during this series, we're going to look at 4 books written by members of Christ Church in 1894, in 1904, in 1944, and 1951. And we're going to ask what their content, but also the people who wrote them, has to teach us in 2026. And the first of these people is a woman called Jessie Challacombe. And Jessie Challacombe was the wife of the second vicar of Christ Church. And here he is, the second vicar of Christ Church, William Allen Challacombe, known as Alan Challacombe, or Mr. Challacombe to most people, who was the vicar here between 1893 and 1920. Now, that oak panelling behind me, up in the chancel that you can see around the communion table, that oak panelling there, that was given in memory of his wife, Jessie Challacombe, when she died in January 1925. That was just 5 years after they left Christ Church, and she died, and news obviously reached people here at Christ Church, and that oak panelling in the chancel around the communion table, that was given in her memory. And if you go and have a look at it, you'll find a plaque that is much smaller than this. I've blown it up rather. And it says, in memory of Jessie Challacombe, wife of William Allen Challacombe, vicar of this parish, 1893 to 1921. That's wrong, actually. It was 1920. And the oak panelling was given as a tribute of affection by members of the Mothers' Union, her Bible class, and friends in the congregation. And before we hear about her books, and she wrote many, it's good to hear a little bit more about Jessie Challacombe herself. She was born as Jessie Worsfold, and she was born in Dover in 1863. And she belonged, like a lot of people at that time, to a large family. So here is the family that she belonged to. There are her parents at the top, and she was one of 11 children. And that included a younger brother called Christopher, named after her father, it seems, who died when he was just 14 years of age. And the family were keen churchgoers. They belonged to Christ Church Dover, and that church no longer exists, but there's an old drawing of that church. And her father was church warden there. And in 1888, right towards the end of the 19th century, a new curate arrived at the church, and his name was Alan Challacombe. And we're not sure how the courtship between Alan and Jessie developed, but basically they were married there in 1891, so just 3 years after he came to the church. And during the rest of Alan's curacy, he and Jessie ran various organisations together, and then in January 1893, they moved to New Malden, where Alan Challacombe had been appointed as vicar of this church. Now, that's what the church looked like when they came here in 1893. And what you can see in that photograph, and it's obviously pretty faint, is that the chancel, this end of the church, is higher than the rest of it. And if you look at the wood up there, you can see where the join is. Can you see that up there? That light-coloured wood all belongs to the part that actually had been built in 1878. The rest of the church was lower then. And then in 1894, the year after they came, this part of the building was raised to the same level as the chancel roof, and they put in that south aisle down there, and they were going to build a tower, but they ran out of money. But that's basically what happens when they arrive here. Now, the first vicar of this church, Charles Sterling, who's remembered by that plaque in the middle of the south aisle over there, he had stayed 27 years, 8 months. And amazingly, that is exactly the amount of time that the Challacombes stayed here as well, 27 years and 8 months. And there are a number of photographs of Alan Challacombe, but just 2 of him with Jessie, and I want to show them to you now. So here is the first one. This comes from fairly early on in their time, in the 1890s, and they're there in front of the old vicarage, and their dog is with them in that photograph. And then we've got another photograph of her and Alan, and that will be just before 1920 when they moved away, and you'll notice quite a difference in what they're wearing. Now, I wanted a better picture of Jessie, and so AI produced this probably slightly glamorized one for me, but there she is in front of the vicarage, and AI has slightly sort of added a few details to it. Alan and Jessie Challacombe had one son, significantly named Christopher, presumably after her father and after the brother who she had that had died, and he was born in the October after they came to Christchurch. And we probably got a photograph of him, because this is another photograph of the old vicarage, and you've got a little boy in the garden there, and it is almost certain that that is Christopher Challacombe. Now, we know from parish magazines, which are preserved in the Kingston History Centre, that Jessie Challacombe had significant health problems. And we know that she eventually died at the age of just 61, as I say, 5 years after the couple moved from Christchurch, New Malden, down to Farnborough, Christchurch, Farnborough. There's the church there. Alan Challacombe was vicar there for a further 28 years, almost exactly the same amount of time that he was here. But as I say, just 5 years into that time, Jessie died. But she obviously made enough impact to get another plaque. That's the plaque on the wall of Christchurch, Farnborough. I phoned their administrator when I knew it existed and said, could you go down and take a picture of it and send it to me? And there it is. It's slightly more impressive than the one we've got, actually. And Jessie Challacombe died of myocarditis. She died of an inflammation of the heart, and it was the very same disease that had carried off her mother in 1894. Now, during her time at this church, Jessie Challacombe had a significant impact. If you remember back to when I read out the plaque a few moments ago, we heard about the various groups that she ran. But alongside this, and more or less separate to it, she also wrote many books. And I've been tracking them down. I have to sometimes spend a bit of money, probably which I haven't got, in tracking down these books from second-hand booksellers, and 1 or 2 still elude me, but I've managed to get and read most of them, and here they are. Here are the books of Jessie Challacombe. Quite an interesting gap between 1904 and 1910, and we do know she had a lot of illness around that time, so it might be that 6-year gap between the top row and the bottom row is because of the very significant health problems that she had. She nearly died around that time. Now, Me and Mine, the book that's read at the far left of the bottom row, that is a book for wives about how they should handle their husbands. It's quite an interesting book. It's kept at the British Library. I haven't managed to actually buy a copy of that, but I have visited the British Library and I've read it, and it's full of interesting details about how Christian wives should relate to their husbands, some of which you'd agree with, some of which you might want to challenge. But the rest of those books are novels, and they are Christian novels. And Jessie Challacombe wrote them really to satisfy the huge demand that there was in the Edwardian era for Sunday school prizes. So Sunday schools were massive. They attracted huge amounts of children, They had in the Victorian era as well. It had fallen off a little bit in the Edwardian era, but still you had a lot of children attending Sunday schools. The Sunday school here was out on the grass out there. There was a tin building called the Tin Tab that was there for 81 years, and the Sunday school met there, and children got prizes for good attendance, for remembering scriptures and so on. And most of these books, the copies that I've got, when I look in the inside cover, you've got a certificate with this is given to so-and-so for good attendance or for remembering their scriptures or whatever like that. But what about the stories themselves? Well, in virtually every case, the plot surrounds a young Christian, quite often a woman, occasionally a man, like Wait and Win. That one there has got a male main character, but most of them have got female central characters who face significant challenges, but through showing perseverance and other Christian virtues, eventually triumph. And the central characters in most cases come from fairly humble backgrounds. Guilt and Gold, that one written in 1910, that's an exception. That's about an upper-class girl who faces various temptations but decides to keep going with her Christian faith. But for the most part, these novels are about people from humble backgrounds, and they're all, in every case, highly idealised. They don't really have any discernible faults whatsoever that I can see. And that's because they're intended to be examples to their readers. And I've read all of these stories in quite a lot of detail and with a lot of care. They are in places rather quaint, and they do contain elements that from the perspective of today are somewhat odd. So there's an awful lot in some of the novels about cleanliness being next to godliness, a big emphasis upon that. But in overall terms, they are a tremendous example. They are a tremendous example of one of our forebears from this church, one of those who's gone before us, who has in common with us this Christian faith, using the gift that she had been given to serve God and, crucially, to encourage others to persevere with him. And the particular novel of Jessie Challacombe that I want to focus on this morning is the one that I consider to be her best, and that's the story called Nell Garton. She published it in 1904, and Nell Garton is the story of a vicar's daughter in the north of England. And her father is a vicar of a parish, and they're in financial difficulty. And because of that, Nell, who's the oldest daughter, decides that she will move down to London and she will seek work so that there's one less mouth to feed and so she can send money back home. Now, the family has other problems as well that Nell isn't particularly looking to resolve. She doesn't necessarily think it's in her power to resolve them, such as the disability of her brother Bertie, the haughtiness of her sister Dolly, and the immaturity of her other sister Ethel. But anyway, she sets off to London with the motive of doing something about the financial difficulties in her family. And she ends up working as a governess for an upper-class family called the Delameres. And she looks after their two young children. And the children are called Hedza, an unusual name, and Muriel. And the book makes it quite clear that these children are starved of attention and affection by their parents. And they're consequently highly rebellious and naughty, but through a combination of imaginative ideas, appropriate firmness, but above all love and affection, Nell soon forms a very firm bond with both of them. And this includes developing their Christian faith. So Mr. and Mrs. Delamere in the story, they're indifferent to Christianity. They're not really bothered about it at all. But they are content for Nell to take their children to church as long as they want to go, as long as she doesn't force them. And after a few ups and downs, the children really get into it, with Nell encouraging them also to do acts of service for other people. So she buys biblical texts and she gets them to colour them in, and they send them back to lonely older people in her father's parish up in the north. And Mr. and Mrs. Delamere start noticing the change in their children's behaviour. They start noticing that their children have changed, and they're intrigued, cautiously, about what has brought this about. So things are all going fairly well, and Nell is pleased about this. She feels that this is her calling to display Christian love, and it will impact upon the children, and in time upon the parents. But then disaster strikes. Something goes badly wrong. There's a huge row between the children and their mother when she wants them to miss church to play with the child of a friend of hers who is visiting. And the children don't want to miss this special service at the church that they've been looking forward to, and so they're very rude to their mother for not allowing them to go, and Mrs. Delamere then blames the influence of church upon them, and Nell is absolutely distraught because she sees all of her witness, all of the work she's done collapsing in front of her. But worse then occurs, as it turns out that the boy who comes to play has given Hedsa and Muriel measles. And measles was then a really serious illness, and they quickly become very ill and dangerously so. And Muriel manages to sort of battle through it, but Hedsa is very close to death. And Nell, despite extreme exhaustion, she stays with the children throughout this time. She refuses to leave their bedside. When the local doctor, Dr. Colville, says, look, you really need to get some sleep, the children get distressed if she leaves, and so she stays with them throughout the time that they're ill, and eventually, after quite a time, they recover. And this is what makes the impact upon the parents, because the fear of losing these children that they've neglected and Nell's loving dedication is eventually what makes the crucial difference to Mr. and Mrs. Delamere engaging with the Christian faith that their children have found, and they come to church to give thanks for their children's recovery. Now, other things then start to become resolved as well. It turns out that the vicar of the church that they go to happens to have studied at theological college with Nell's father, and on hearing of the plight of his former friend, he's able to help him financially. Also, in Nell's absence down in London, her siblings make greater progress towards greater independence and maturity, and romance is also present as Nell ends up marrying Dr. Colville, the doctor who had attended the children, who admired her efforts to care for them, and who also belongs to her church. Now, from a literary point of view, and I'm not particularly qualified to make judgment in that regard, but from a literary point of view, Nell Garton probably isn't the greatest novel, and parts of it, particularly towards the end, are a little bit contrived. But it's charming, in places quite funny. It's ahead of its time in its insights on child psychology and on parenting and on the need for affection. You know, given it's written in 1904, it's really, quite amazing that it has those emphases. And especially when Hedsa and Muriel are ill, it's extremely gripping. But most of all, the novel Nell Garton is deeply inspiring. It's inspiring in its message, which I believe is as relevant to us now as when the book was first published 122 years ago. For those of you who want to hear the book in its entirety, it is available as an audio book on YouTube. During COVID, when people were isolated, I read a couple of chapters each week, and my daughter Abby read the part of Nell, and I dropped it in on CD to those who didn't have the internet in the parish. And if you want to listen to the story, it's easily found on YouTube if you've got access to the internet. But what is the message that this book contains? Well, for me, three things particularly stand out, starting with this. I think the first big message of this novel is the calling to Christians, to those who follow Jesus, to step out in faith. Nell, in the story, doesn't want to leave her home of Norton. That's where she belongs. That's where her family are. And she's got a significant ministry as well. She's a Sunday school teacher there, which she takes very seriously. And yet she feels called by God to give that up and to step out in faith. And that sense of calling continues throughout the story, but its beginning point is crucial, as Nell takes this courageous step to leave behind everything that she knows and move to London, not knowing what will happen there. I say to leave everything. Of course, what she does take with her is her Christian faith and her belief that God will be with her. And throughout the Bible, we see God issuing very similar calls to people to leave what they know and travel to the place he'll show them. So that's what happens with Abraham, doesn't it? Abraham is called to leave his homeland and his family and travel to a place that God will show him. Something similar happens to Moses when he's called to return back to Egypt. But Ruth and Jonah are further examples. All of these characters are called, and they respond in a mixture of ways, to step out in faith. The same is actually true of the disciples, those fishermen by Lake Galilee, when Jesus calls them, Peter, Andrew, James and John, to follow him. And the key point is that none of those people who are called by God knew the precise destination to which they were headed. Because the most important part of that calling was to follow God and to trust him on the way, to trust him on the journey. And when the writer of the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament talks about faith, he gives a great big long list of heroes of faith. He goes through various characters in the Old Testament, and then he says this: these people were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what they'd been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. And one of the vital points that that verse is making is the importance of faith on the journey. We are called to journey with God, and certainly in the case of those people listed in Hebrews 11, the fulfillment of what they were journeying towards was not during their lifetime received. It was awaited after that lifetime. And that in many ways is similar with us. We are called to journey with God. He calls us to leave what we know very frequently and to follow him. And the crucial point is trusting him on the journey. So inspired by that verse and by the story of Nell Garton that Jessie Challacombe wrote, where does that challenge lie for us at this moment? Is there a need that God has made you aware of where you're being called to respond to that need by stepping out in faith? Where might God be calling you to step out of your comfort zone and show a bit of courage for him? The really key thing to remember is that thing remembered by Nell Garton in this story, that God always promises to go with us when we step out in faith. God doesn't call us to journey to the fresh place that he will show us and we're out on our own. God always promises to travel alongside us. So he does call us to journey with him, but the with him is the really crucial part of it. So that, I suggest, is the first part of this book's message, which is as valuable to us as it would have been to its first readers 122 years ago. But here's the second point, and perhaps the most obvious one from this book. A big part of its message is the power of God's love. One of the things that you may have noticed as I summarise the story is the similarity between the story of Nell Garton and that of The Sound of Music. Both stories are about an earnest young Christian woman who eventually becomes a governess to neglected children and eventually transforms an entire family with her love. In fact, if it hadn't been written years before the events on which The Sound of Music were based, you might think there'd been a certain amount of plagiarism. But the similarity between this story written in 1904 and this much later story and musical from the 1960s is that both display the transforming power of God's love. Nell Garton, like Maria in The Sound of Music, shows plenty of energy and imagination, plenty of oomph in the way that she looks after Hedzer and Muriel. But what transforms them is her love. And that's eventually what starts to transform the parents as well. And the reason why love has this power is because of what our second reading said. This was our second reading today. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. And then later on it says these words, no one's ever seen God, so how do they become aware of him? Well, if we love one another, God lives in us and his love is made complete in us. You see, know that we're loved by God, and know that his love lives within us, and we will find the confidence to believe in the amazing power that that love has. Nell Garton, as I said earlier, is a rather idealised character. She's one that never really shows any frustration or anger, whatever the provocation, and the lack of any obvious flaws is probably a weakness of the story in one way. But it's nonetheless an idealisation that can be helpful if it encourages us to believe that God really has given each one of us who belongs to him a supernatural divine power. A supernatural divine power called love that really can overcome everything negative and destructive within this world. We need to believe in the power of that love. If we really believe in the power of that love, we'll have the confidence to display it. And if we can find the courage to show love in the most difficult and unpromising of situations, it is truly amazing what God can then bring about through this. Very often when we take that step to really believe in the transforming power of God's love, a lot more can then happen than we've expected or even intended. And that links to the final part of the story's message, which is this. The story of Nell Garton by Jessie Challacombe very strongly witnesses to the mysterious providence of God. You see, in this book, Jessie Challacombe presents the front of the story of Nell Garton as about Nell herself. The emphasis throughout is on her courage, her faith, and her love. But behind this, particularly as the story develops, we see a constant belief in the action of God himself. The past connection that emerges between the vicar in London and Nell's father is part of that, but the most dramatic is the way that God works through the disaster of the children's terrible illness and the events that have caused it to reveal more of his love. And that's what we see again and again in the pages of the Bible. God doesn't just work through the positive actions of his followers, but God also finds ways, remarkable ways, of working through disasters as well to bring about his purpose. Quite often it's when absolute disaster strikes that love can shine most brightly. Because love makes the biggest difference, doesn't it, when terrible things occur. And that's one of the principal ways that God can work through us. Terrible disasters happen. Those things aren't caused by God, but they are allowed to happen. But God then finds a way of displaying his powerful love against the background and even through those really terrible events. And the implicit message throughout this novel is that Nell feels called to do the right things, knowing that the God revealed in Jesus Christ will be constantly working his purpose out behind the scenes. And we need to have a similar faith. We need to have a similar faith in the providential action of God. We're called to do our bit. We're called to show love. We're called to be courageous. We're called to show faith in showing love in circumstances that can often look very unpromising, in the belief that the God revealed in Jesus Christ will be working through events, including our contribution, mixed though that might be. So, 122 years after this novel was first published, I believe its message is as true for us here at Christchurch in 2026 as it was for those who first read it soon after it was published in 1904. And I believe we can really be inspired by its message, and we can be inspired as well by this amazing Edwardian lady, one of the greatest forebears in the history of this church. She battled with so much hardship. Her health was constantly fragile. She had that terrible blow of the loss of her younger brother at the age of just 14. She had further tragedies in her life. When the First World War occurred, her son Christopher went off and fought on the Western Front. It was her only son. He did survive, but he came back with terrible shell shock from which he never really recovered. And Jessie dies in 1925. Her husband lives a lot longer. He is vicar of Christchurch, Farnborough, for a further 28 years, and he dies at the age of 86 or so in 1951. But just 6 months later, Christopher, their only son, also died as well. I'm not sure what the circumstances were. But Jessie Challacombe had to see a lot of suffering during her life, her own fragile health, as well as other hardships as well. And yet she kept going. She sought to spread the message of the transforming love of God in Jesus Christ to as many people as possible. She did what she could in running groups here at this church, did that very powerfully and effectively, and she used these literary skills that God had given her to send that witness further. She may be largely forgotten today. I only found about her because I Googled her name and suddenly found all these books and had to check it was the same person, and I discovered about her legacy. And we shouldn't forget her, just like we should try and remember as much as possible those who have gone before us in this church during the 160 years of its existence. But particularly in terms of Jessie Challacombe, we need to remember, in the light of our first reading this morning, someone who really did believe those words about giving her life for the gospel of Jesus Christ and not being ashamed of him, and the role, as I say, that she played both at Christchurch New Malden for a brief amount of time, at Christchurch Farnborough down in Hampshire, and beyond that through her writing in spreading the message, the transforming message of God's love. Let's pray.